Hey peeps, welcome back to Project Anonymous, and in today's video,
we're going to go over everything in Inkstitch Params.
So let's get to it.
So this was a requested video by someone who commented in one of our videos. And there are a lot of different settings that you can do in Params, and we really just go over just a few in our videos. So today we're going to go over every single setting that you can make in Params to customize your embroidery projects.
To locate Inkstitch's Params, you just have to go to Extensions, Inkstitch, Params.
And we made a convenient little shortcut here so that we don't have to go through this menu tree every time we go to Inkstitch. So you'll see us taking advantage of that today for this video. You can see we have no objects in here, so Params is not going to open up. One thing I will mention is that your Params menu will differ depending on what type of objects that you're highlighting to go into Params. So if you don't have a fill object, you're not going to see the fill menu. If you don't have a stroke, you're not going to see the stroke menu items. So we're going to go ahead and just start with an easy, simple circle with a fill. So right now we have it with a black fill and a red stroke. And we'll just start with that just to show you some things here. Shift Control P, and it brings up our Params menu. So one thing we noticed that we had talked about before in a previous video about, I think it was our first Inkstitch tutorial, where we assumed here in the Params where it stitched out the satin stitch first and then the fill stitch, that's how it was going to stitch out. Well, that's not necessarily the case. That's the way it shows in Params, but if we cancel out of this and we go to the Simulator Realistic Preview, you'll see when it actually stitches out, it's smart enough to know to stitch out the fill stitch first. So you'll see the fill stitch stitching out, and then it goes to the satin stitch last. So that's something we kind of learned later on down the road, that the Params menu is just going to give you the initial settings. It also, we used it initially as an indicator if this was going to stitch out appropriately, if it was going to work. And that's also not necessarily the case, as we found out when doing lettering on top of other objects, where it would give us an error, but it would stitch out just fine. Mm-hmm. So using Params as an indicator of if it's going to stitch out appropriately or not is not necessarily the right way to go about it. The Simulator Realistic Preview is probably the better way to see if it's going to stitch out. The Params menu should just be used for setting up each object however you want to stitch it out. Okay, so we're going to go back into Params here. So you can see we have all of our settings here that we can manipulate with this particular object that it shows us, but that's we'll get into those specifics later. I just want to show that if we got rid of the stroke, for instance, we're going to start losing some of these menu items. So the first selection here is the stroke, and that's going to be this outer red border here. That's your stroke. And you can adjust a lot of different things about that. So the first thing, if you click on this manual stitch path, what that does is it changes it to just stitch where the nodes are. This is not going to look good for us and wouldn't be something that we would select for this particular case. But if we, for instance, wanted to stitch out a very specific shape, then we could just click the nodes where we want the stitches to happen, and then click on this little selector, and it will stitch out exactly the way we want it versus how the Inkstitch software wanted it to stitch out. So the next setting is repeats. So if you change this to 2, it basically means it's going to stitch around twice and give you double the density of that particular stroke. The next thing is bean stitch. So a bean stitch is a straight stitch that repeats itself. So it's not going to look right on this because it's not the right type of stroke. We're just going to do a simple straight line here. Use our Bezier tool. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to our fill and stroke tab and stroke style, and we're going to change this to a dashed line. Now our dashed line will give us just a straight stitch, right? And we've seen that in projects like our applique projects. We will use this If you wanted that straight stitch to be a little bit denser, you would use a bean stitch. So if we change this to a bean stitch, we can repeat it. And what's going to happen, it's going to go back and forth, back and forth. And when we go into the realistic preview, you can see it's going to give us a denser straight stitch called the bean stitch. So this is good for like outlined drawings to embroidery, like on a quilt. So the next setting is the running stitch length. A running stitch is basically this guy right here that goes underneath a stitch to hold it down. And on a stroke, we have not been using any kind of underlay. We will get to that later on in the custom satin stitch, but that's a setting right there for how the length of a stitch underneath your main stroke would be. And finally, one we use a lot is our zigzag spacing. Megan, tell us about the zigzag spacing.
So the zigzag spacing we usually use for puff embroidery because we need to make sure it's dense enough to cover the puff foam, so it just makes anything a little bit more denser. If
you changed it to half that, 0.2, you're going to see our stroke get much denser. And as Megan said, in our puff embroidery, we want to cover as much of the foam as possible. And then lastly is lock stitches. So you'll notice when we do our projects, the embroidery machine will start in one spot and go back and forth a few times. That's a lock stitch. And it usually is set for both at the beginning and the end. You could turn your lock stitches off completely, off at the end or off at the beginning. We typically leave this on for both. The next menu is your autofill menu, and that's going to be everything in the black here. So not your stroke, but just the fill area. The first thing that we have is automatically routed fill stitching. If you deselect this, none of these settings will be applicable. Everything's going to be done in your fill tab here. If you're getting issues where it's not meeting in the middle just right, where there's just a slight little gap, well, you can turn off the auto routed fill stitching and go to a manual fill stitching, which will basically create a single stitching line all the way up. You will, however, lose your underlay, but maybe you don't need the underlay.
So the first setting within this setting is angle of lines of stitches.
You could change the angle of stitches for individual objects so that you get that look that you want. The next setting is expand. What this will do is it will actually expand your fill out based off of how much larger you want it to be. So if you have two objects that are butted up against each other in a project and you kind of want them to overlap just a little bit, just to make sure there's no gap in those objects, you can increase, you can see here, let's just increase this by 5, and you can see that this fill stitch will increase outside of the little satin here. Look at this. Obviously we made that a little bit too much, but you can see you can expand those individual objects, and you can also go in the minus direction. So if it was too big and you wanted to decrease it, you just hit minus, and you'll see our fill is now within. Now you can see the underlay is a little bit larger, but you can also adjust this expand feature in the underlay right here, autofill underlay. Well, we did -1 last time, so we can do that. 1 millimeter, and this should look right now. Go back to autofill, and we'll go ahead and change that back to 0 because we don't want that. Okay, so the next setting, maximum fill stitch length, that is going to be how long each individual stitch is. 3 is the default, and we haven't had a need to expand that any further, but if you want a slightly different look, you can change this. Next, spacing between rows. This will solve any issues where you can see material in between your stitches. If you decrease this number, if we change it to 0.1, you'll see that the stitches become much more dense. But you can adjust this to get rid of gaps you see within your fill stitch. Next up is your running stitch length. Your running stitches are the stitches that go underneath your stitches, and you can adjust how close or far apart those stitches are here. And then if you have a very dense stitched project, and we could turn lock stitches off, but you could also skip the last stitch in each row, and we'll go and select this so you can see what that looks like. So you can see the effects of that here, where it's skipping stitches every so often to make it less dense in this outer area. And again, it would work perfectly for this particular project because you have a satin stitch that's going to cover it anyway. You're never going to see any skipped stitches along this edge. So this might be something that we should take advantage of in the future when we have a satin stitch around. Next up is the number of staggered rows before repeating. So this is what gives you pattern. So let's go ahead and pull this up in our simulator to show you what we're talking about. So right here you can see the pattern of the fill stitch, right? And right now our pattern is set to 4 repeating. So you can see on the 4th line is where the stitch will be that corresponds with the other one. And that's what kind of gives us this little diagonal pattern. Well, you can adjust that. You can change that to as many or as little as you want for repeating patterns to give you the fill stitch look that you want. Our default is 4 and we think we get good results with that. But just for sake of argument, we can show you what that looks like.
So you can see the pattern changed, which now it's every 8 down that it has that little spot there.
Right, in the same vertical line.
So the next setting is underpath. So what this does is it gets rid of all these lines here. So if we just deselect this, you guys can see what it looks like. So what can this be useful for?
Honestly, I find the underpath helpful in holding down the material to the stabilizer. So I would never unselect this. I'm trying to think of a reason why I would, because you never really see the underpath when you're done with the project. The fill always covers everything. So you're not ever gonna notice those lines being there or not. We've already talked about locking stitches. Okay, so just like your stroke, you can turn on and off your locking stitches at the beginning and the end of the project. Over to Autofill Underlay. So again, this is only when you have automatically routed fill stitching on can you adjust the Autofill Underlay. And what this does is it adjusts these vertical lines here. So again, you can change the angle so it's not vertical. Say you wanted it to be 45 degrees for your underlay. It'll give you a slightly different look. But again, you're not going to see this because the fill will go on top of it. The other thing you can do is you can inset, we did this before, we changed it to a 1mm inset from the outside of the fill stitch. And we just changed that because we were playing around with the other side. So this is normally 0 and it's normally a fine setting. Just like before, you can adjust the maximum stitch length. I believe it defaults to whatever the autofill is. So it's normally left empty, that's fine. Between row spacing, so if again you were trying to cut down on the number of stitches on, if you have a very delicate material, you can increase the row spacing between these rows. I'm just gonna change this back to 0 so you know what we're talking about. We're talking about the vertical rows. If I increase this to say 3mm, you'll see the vertical rows separate apart a little bit. So on a delicate material where you still wanted to hold it down with these vertical rows first and then go in with your fill stitch, and you can cut down on the number of stitches required for this operation. And just like on your autofill, you can skip last stitch on each row to decrease the number of stitches required. Yeah, you'll see some of these stitches are skipped. And then you can completely turn off the underpath of the underlay. This is funny to say. And if you deselect this, you can turn off your vertical lines completely. So this is what it would look like without an underlay. And if you're looking to get really neat, see this? This is an underpath of your autofill, and you can turn off your underpath of your autofill. So it's just clean lines. So a bunch of different settings for your fill to get the custom look that you're looking for. So everything else, we're going to need a custom satin stitch in order to look at.
So we just make 2 lines and then kind of make a train track.
Yeah, so just like we've talked about before in other videos about making custom satin stitches. And if you hit Command K, Control K on a Windows, or you can just go to Path and Combine. Now, when you go into Params, we can go to Satin Column, Custom Satin Stitch. And you'll see this is something that we've done before on projects. Well, there's some additional things that you can do on this Some projects, you may want an E-stitch on. An E-stitch is really just where the line is at the bottom here, and it just kind of stitches up and back and goes to the next one, which would look like an E if there was just a few of them, right? And you can change the spacing here to whatever you want to give you the look that you want here. So if you were doing, I don't know, like a sports jersey, and you were sewing on a number, a lot of those uses the E-stitch, I believe, to stitch down a jersey name or number. Zigzag to spacing will give you how dense, just like on a stroke, how dense you want that satin stitch to be. We'll go and change this back to default as 4. So this is really cool. Pull compensation. So if you find yourself in the lettering tool and you find that your letters are coming out really scrunched together because the material is pulling itself together, you can compensate here to make the letters and numbers a little bit thicker so that when it scrunches together, it gives you the results that you want. Unfortunately, it's going to be a trial and error. It depends on the type of fabric you're using, how well you hoop it, and what your tension is on your machine. The end result is supposed to be what you planned for in Inkstitch. We talked about zigzagging, and then the lock stitches, same deal. At the beginning and the end, you can turn them on or off. If you want to lock down your material before this satin column lays down to keep the material, pressed down to the stabilizer so it doesn't get pulled too bad, you can do some underlays here. So the first one is just a center walk underlay, and that's just going to draw a line right down the middle, come back, and then do your satin stitch.
What would that be useful for?
So this center line one would be good if you have loose material down before you do your satin stitch. This will lock it down, and then it will go on top of it with an underlay so that it doesn't shift during the satin stitch operation. Another one, you can do a contour underlay. And by the way, you can do all of these underlays at the same time if you'd like, but a contour underlay will basically lay stitches down on each side of your satin stitch. You can see that here. So it's locking it down, and then it puts a satin stitch on top. The settings for this is just going to be, well, how inset do you want that underlay, and then how long each stitch would be. So 1.5 millimeters is the default here. Lastly is a zigzag underlay. You see this a lot in the lettering tool. When it lays down the default letters that comes with Inkstitch, it will usually come down with a zigzag underlay first. And you'll see here, all that does is it lays down the zigzag on top. So you can see we had the other underlays first, but what this will do, again, it will very neatly lock down your material before laying the satin stitch on top. So again, this is very useful if you're having pulling issues on your material. This is something I wish we did before we did our Craftsman shirts, for instance. If we put down these underlays before doing a satin stitch, it would reduce the amount of pulling that we would have. Now, we ended up using a fill stitch for our lettering because we were afraid that it was going to do too much pulling. But in this case, this should resolve a lot of the pulling issues.
So we use this as our example, but when most of these settings really comes in is when you're doing lettering. So if you wanted to add text into like your lettering tool, this is really when it would come in handy.
Yeah, so why don't you do a little test word here and we can test some of those settings. So right now we can see here that it has a zigzag underlay as well as a center line underlay. And those are settings that you can adjust in the Params.
So this is very nice, so you can customize this. So if you're seeing any problems when you're stitching out these letters, like too much pull, you can just add or delete any of these settings for it.
The last menu item that we didn't talk about is a manual fill. So all the way over on the edge here, again, these underlays are with custom satin stitches only. Fill, we can do a manually routed fill stitch. So why would we want to do a manually routed fill stitch? I would say only in the case where we are having issues where the software is breaking up an object on starting from the bottom, working up, and then breaks up and goes to the top and works down, and it's not meeting in the middle, and nothing else that we're doing is working to resolve that, changing the density or changing the angle, nothing is working. I would then do a manually routed fill stitch, because you can see here, it started at the top and it worked all the way down to the bottom, and that was done. So I would not have any of the issues with the auto routed fill stitch. So this one, you can just click on the manual routed fill stitch, and then you'll see that you'll have some options that are available to you. So just like your autofill, you can change the angle that this stitch is in. You can change it from starting it from one side, going over to the other, maximum fill length, spacing between rows, all the same settings that you have in the autofill. The only difference is there is no underlay for this, but you'll have one continuously stitched out object. That may be the results that you're looking for versus what autofill would do. But again, for our stuff, I would say this is last case resort if nothing else was working.
So I really hope you found this video helpful, but if you need any extra information, where we found most of this information from was a website on Inkstitch.
Yeah, so the inkstitch.org website has all of this information in much more detail. We are just users of this stuff, and we've done some trial and error on our own projects. Wish we knew a lot of this stuff before we filmed this video, because it would have resolved a lot of the issues that we've seen in previous projects that many of you have commented on to help us out. So we really do appreciate your comments and your help in guiding us through this embroidery process.
So our biggest lesson learned, I'd say here, is that we shouldn't be using Params as our check to make sure it can embroider. I think that's more of simulator realistic previews job, because a lot of things we notice don't work in Params, but then they work when we stitch them out, so.
Yeah, we should be using Params as it's intended, which is parameters for each individual path that we're going to embroider.
So I really hope this video helped and you could learn something new. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like it if you liked it.
Like it.
Subscribe if you enjoy our content.
Subscribe.
And turn on those notifications so you get my every single time we post a video. Stay crafty.
And be happy.
Bye!